Hello everyone, I'm Ixalan, and welcome back to Ixalan Limited Review Week here on my channel. So far, we've looked at the white and blue cards in the set, and today we're looking at black. If you want to see how I grade these cards, you can find a link in the description below that'll take you to my grading guide. Also keep in mind, all of these ratings are based on my first impressions of the card before actually getting the chance to play with any of them. Now, let's go ahead and jump to the first card, which is Anointed Deacon. Anointed Deacon is a common for 4 generic and 1 black. It is a 3/3 vampire cleric, and it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may have target vampire get +2/+0 until end of turn. So vampires are one of the creature types that's supported by tribal synergies in this set, and it shows up in black and white primarily. We're going to see a lot of vampires today. 5 mana for a 3/3 isn't great, so obviously if your deck isn't vampire heavy, it's not going to be that good. Of course, it can at least make itself a 5/3 in that situation because it can actually pump itself, and that's not terrible. So I think it's probably a D in a deck that doesn't have enough vampires. I think this gets considerably better in a vampire deck, though, especially in a deck that can make a ton of vampire tokens. All of those tokens have lifelink, and you can usually attack with a 3/1 and force at least a trade on many board states. So doing that every turn, or frequently at least, seems pretty attractive. It's definitely not the best of the vampire payoffs, but it is at least a card you probably want one of in most vampire decks, so it's probably a C if you really get there on vampires. Next, we have Arguel's Bloodfast, which is the double-faced card in the cycle of rare legendary enchantments that flip into lands. On the Arguel's Bloodfast side, it is 1 generic and a black for a rare legendary enchantment, and it has an activated ability where you can pay 1 colorless and 1 black and 2 life to draw a card. And it also says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 5 or less life, you may transform Arguel's Bloodfast. It then transforms into Temple of Aklazat, a legendary land that can add 1 black mana to your mana pool, and you can tap it and sacrifice a creature to gain life equal to that sacrificed creature's toughness. Unlike the other cards in this cycle, I actually think that what this card does before it transforms is more powerful than the land side. Being able to pay mana and a couple life to draw cards is good and can really grind you out a win thanks to all your card advantage. However, if your life drops low enough, 5 or less, this turns into Temple of Aklazat, which isn't really that exciting. Yes, it lets you sacrifice creatures to gain life equal to their toughness, so it has some nice synergy. You've clearly dropped yourself to 5 or less, and that's why it's transformed, so being able to gain some life off of it isn't too bad. It's a fine ability, but it isn't always going to be very relevant. Like I said, I'd rather have an enchantment that just lets me pay life to draw cards, although it is nice that eventually when you run out of life, the enchantment does not remain useless, which is entirely possible with other cards like this because you just can't use it anymore. So at least it turns into a land and can give you a bit of life or whatever. So overall, I think this is a B-. I think I would first pick it in some weaker packs. Next, we have Bishop of the Bloodstained, which is 3 generic and 2 black for a 3/3 vampire cleric at uncommon. And it says, when Bishop of the Bloodstained enters the battlefield, target opponent loses 1 life for each vampire you control. On its own, this is a 5 mana 3/3 that makes your opponent lose 1 life. In a vacuum, that's unplayable, and that's an F. However, this card, of course, also gets a build-around grade too. The more vampires you have, the better this gets, though it does still suffer from the problem that you have to have a decent-sized board with 3 or 4 vampires in play for this to really be worth it. There's also going to be situations where you have like 10 vampires in play, and it just ends the game. There's all these vampire tokens running around, and that's going to be pretty nice. I do think it only caps out at around a C+, though, because it's sort of magical Christmas land to think you're going to have 10 vampires all the time. You'll probably have 3 or 4 usually, which still means this is worth playing, but it's not as exciting as doing 10, obviously. Next, we have Blight Keeper, which is 1 black mana for a 1/1 Bat Imp, and it is common and it has flying, and it has an activated ability. 7 generic and 1 black, sacrifice Blight Keeper, target opponent loses 4 life, and you gain 4 life. This is the black card in the cycle of 1-drops that have 8 mana activated abilities that require them to sacrifice themselves. As a 1 mana 1/1 flyer, Blight Keeper is a good raid enabler in the early game, but it has what is the least impactful activated ability on any of the cards in this cycle. So unlike the rest, it is actually best in the early game, as its late game ability will not usually be a huge game changer. Though indeed, having that extra reach on a body that gets in for a few damage early certainly doesn't hurt. I think this is a C-. Maybe it gets to C if you really want to get there on raid early in the game. Next, we have Bloodcrazed Paladin, which is 1 generic and 1 black for a 1/1 Vampire Knight at rare, and it has flash, and it says, Bloodcrazed Paladin enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each creature that died this turn. I like this card because it is basically a 2-drop that is good at all stages of the game. In the early game, playing him as a 2 mana 3/3 isn't too hard. All you have to do is attack into your opponent's trade, and you 2 creatures die and he can become a 3/3. In the late game, it has a good chance of getting even bigger. Coming with Flash also makes this a threat to flash in and eat another creature, which always feels pretty good. But it's good to keep in mind that unlike most creatures who you can flash in, it's going to be hard to make it so that he gets big when you're playing him during combat, because combat's where you're going to have the most creatures die. While he can be nice at all stages of the game, there will definitely be games where the best you can do is play a 2-mana 2/2 with Flash, which is still solid, but certainly not amazing. I do think he's a B-. I'm willing to spend an early pick on him just because he has so much upside in the late game, and it's also a vampire, which certainly doesn't hurt. Next, we have Boneyard Parlay, which is 5 generic and 2 black for a mythic rare sorcery, and it says, exile up to 5 target creature cards from graveyards. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles, put all cards from the pile of your choice onto the battlefield under your control, and the rest into their owner's graveyards. This is a very cool card design, but don't let all that text fool you, and don't let the rarity trick you either. While it's a solid card, it certainly has pitfalls. First, it costs 7 mana, which isn't always going to be easy to get to, even with treasure around. Second, you need graveyards to be well stocked, ideally with at least 5 creatures so you can make your opponent's decision as hard as possible. Third, if the cards in the graveyard are all ultra-whelming, like 2-drops and the like, while this will be fine since you'll probably get at least 2 cards for 7 mana, that isn't going to feel great. However, that is basically the floor of the card. There will also be games where it also just wins since you get to reanimate multiple creatures from graveyards, and keep in mind you can use your opponent's graveyard as well. Overall, this is a great finisher for a control deck that has been killing stuff and trading all game, and in that deck I think it is worth a B- or so, making it first pickable in some weaker packs. You do basically have to be a control deck to make it work, but if you can play this, it's going to be very good. Just remember that it will sometimes rot in your hand, but it will also sometimes just win games. Next, we have Contract Killing, which is 3 generic and 2 black for a common sorcery that says, destroy target creature. Create 2 colorless treasure artifact tokens with sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So that's what all of the treasure artifact tokens do, so in the future I'm not going to read what they do, and we're going to see more of them in black. 5 is a bit clunky to kill a creature at sorcery speed, but I like the design here. While you might take a tempo hit to kill a creature with this, sometimes you're just going to kill like a 3 or 4 drop because you have to, you do get some of that mana back thanks to the treasure it gives you. Treasure fixes and rams for you, both of which are pretty nice, especially when attached to a decent removal spell. If you can drop a 7-drop on your next turn, the fact you paid 5 to kill a creature during your main phase the turn before isn't a big deal. It doesn't hurt that black has a few payoffs for making treasure too. I think the treasure upside staple to this card makes it a little better than it would be if all it was a 5-mana removal spell, which would probably be a C, and it gets all the way up to C+ thanks to the treasures. And I wouldn't be surprised if treasures end up being even better than I think they're going to be in this set. It may even push all the way to B-, but we'll just have to see. Next, we have Costly Plunder, which is 1 generic and 1 black for a common instant that says, as an additional cost to cast Costly Plunder, sacrifice an artifact or creature, draw 2 cards. Normally, an effect like this is kind of mediocre, like a D, makes your deck sometimes, but you'll cut it a lot. I think this card has the potential to be sneaky good in this format, though. Black has a ton of ways to make treasure, some of which we've already seen, and cashing one of those in for 2 cards is a good deal. Black, especially when paired with white, also has the ability to make a ton of creature tokens, vampire tokens especially, and cashing those in for 2 cards is pretty good. It is also an instant, so you can cast it in response to removal or chump block and use it. Because of the environment, I actually think a lot of black decks will play 1 copy of this and not be upset about it, and I think that makes it a C. Next, we have Dark Nourishment, which is 4 generic and 1 black for an uncommon instant that says, Dark Nourishment deals 3 damage to target creature or player, you gain 3 life. This is not the most impressive removal spell. 5 to do 3 isn't all that good, even if you're also gaining 3. The fact that it is an instant does mean you can make some blowouts happen in response to combat tricks and such, but still, 5 mana is a lot for this effect. It's going to trade down a lot of the time, and that's not ideal. I would almost rather it couldn't hit players and cost 4, as that would be a better card than what we have here. This is another C+ removal spell for black. You'll end up playing one of these a lot, but I don't think it's first pickable premium removal, and I'm not even sure it's better than Contract Killing, honestly. Next, we have Deadeye Tormentor, which for 2 generic and a black is a common human pirate, and it has Raid. Raid is a mechanic that shows up in this set. We've seen it before in Khans of Tarkir block. And basically, you get a bonus if you attacked with a creature on the turn you're playing the creature or other card with Raid. And this one says, when Deadeye Tormentor enters the battlefield, if you attacked with a creature this turn, target opponent discards a card. If you can trigger Raid with this, you are basically getting a 2-for-1 when you play it, which I'm all in for. But you won't always be able to trigger Raid. But hey, at least this is also a pirate. This is a solid playable for black deck, and not much more, and I think that means it's a C. Next, we have Deadeye Tracker, which is 1 black mana for a 1/1 human pirate at rare, and it has an activated ability where you can pay 1 generic, 1 black mana, tap it, and exile 2 cards from an opponent's graveyard, and Deadeye Tracker explores. This is the first time we're seeing Explore in this video, so I'll remind you what it does. It allows you to reveal the top card of your library. You put that card into your hand if it's a land, but if it's not a land, you put a +1/+1 counter on the creature, then put the card into your graveyard or on top of your library. I like Explore a lot, which you may have gathered from my other videos. I think it's a great mechanic just in terms of how interesting it'll make gameplay, but I also think it is a strong mechanic because Explore basically lets you scry, sort of, if you hit a non-land, and if you're hitting a land, you're also getting through your deck more quickly, because how it makes you scry is that if you have a non-land on top of your library that you don't actually want, you can just dump it in your graveyard and try to draw something better. And a repeatable source of Explore is very strong, and I think this will probably be better in Constructed than it is here, because the problem this card has is that the graveyard's not always going to be full. In fact, this card is sort of the opposite of most 1-drops. It isn't all that good in the early game because it's not going to have much to exile, but in the late game it can certainly slowly grind you out a win thanks to exploring over and over again. It's also a pirate, as many cards in this particular video are. I think this is a C+, though, since he isn't exactly an aggressive creature. Your opponent also won't always have tons of cards in their yard for it to use as fuel either. It can only exile your opponent's cards, unfortunately, so keep that in mind. Next, we have Deathless Agent, which is 4 generic and 2 black for a 4/4 Vampire Knight at uncommon. It has flying, and you can tap 3 untapped vampires you control to return Deathless Agent from your graveyard to your hand. A 6 mana 4/4 flyer is a little more than you want to play, but I think it's about a C. Something you will cut some of the time and something you'll play some of the time. However, not only is this card already a vampire, it is a payoff for vampires. If your deck has 8 or more vampires or something like that, I think it jumps all the way to the B range, since it is an evasive threat that just refuses to stay dead. And there's a lot of ways to make vampire tokens in this set, and so getting 4 vampires in play, 3 vampires in play isn't going to be all that hard. I like this card a lot in vampire decks, and I think it pushes all the way to B+. And I do think this card perhaps has enough upside to first pick in some weaker packs, because you could potentially end up with enough vampires to make it good, and its floor isn't all that low. Like, you'll play it with 0 vampires in your deck sometimes, and you won't feel too bad about it. Next, we have Desperate Castaways, which is 1 generic and 1 black for a 2/3 human pirate at common, and it says Desperate Castaways can't attack unless you control an artifact. While not a terrible card if you have 0 artifacts in your deck or ways to make treasure, simply because it can block pretty effectively and it has the pirate creature type, it is probably a D if you don't have a lot of ways to make treasure or otherwise get artifacts into play, at which point I think it moves into the C range and becomes a solid playable. Next, we have Direfleet Hoarder, who for 1 generic and 1 black is a 2/1 human pirate at common, and it says when Direfleet Hoarder dies, create a colorless treasure artifact token. A 2 mana 2/1 with upside, making a piece of treasure when it dies, is pretty solid. Ramping you and providing you fixing, as well as helping out the blue-black archetype the most, that's the color pair that cares the most about treasure, means this is pretty solid. I think it's a C+. Just trading with something and getting a piece of treasure sounds pretty good to me. Next, we have Direfleet Interloper, which is for 3 generic and 1 black, a 2/2 human pirate at common, and it has Menace, and it says when Direfleet Interloper enters the battlefield, it explores. So this is either a 4 mana 3/3 with Menace that also sort of lets you scry, or a 4 mana 2/2 with Menace that draws you a card. Both modes are nice, but neither is anything special. It is nice that it is a pirate and it explores, meaning it fits well into 2 different archetypes, but I'm still going to give it a C. Next, we have Dire Fleetravager, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 Orc Pirate Wizard at Mythic Rare. It has Menace, it has Death Touch, and it says when Dire Fleetravager enters the battlefield, each player loses a third of his or her life rounded up. A 5 mana 4/4 with Menace and Death Touch is something I'm on board with all day long, and I think that alone would probably get into the B- range, but this comes with the added bonus of doing a few extra points of damage, and the fact that it's a pirate. Keep in mind it does lower your life too, but this is going to be an excellent curve topper in aggressive black decks, because you're probably going to have higher life than your opponent on turn 1, and you're going to hurt them more, get them closer to being dead. Menace and Death Touch are a nasty combination, since you can basically guarantee you get a 2-for-1 with that combination of keywords if you're the one attacking. I would first pick this and be pretty happy about it. I think it is a B+. Next, we have Duress, which for 1 black mana is a common sorcery, and it says target opponent reveals his or her hand. You choose a non-creature, non-land card from it. That player discards that card. We've seen this card a lot and other cards like it, and I think this will be what it usually is in Limited, a mediocre mainboard card. One you only stick in if things went terribly wrong, but a serviceable sideboard card. I think that means it's a D in your main board, basically. It's not the worst thing to run, but sometimes you're just going to whiff with it, and that's going to feel terrible. Using a card and not taking one of your opponents is one of the best ways to lose a game in Magic. If your opponent is packing lots of removal and big splashy spells, you will want to bring this in, and I think it's a C out of your sideboard. Next, we have Fathom Fleet Captain, which for 1 generic and 1 black is a 2/1 human pirate with menace, and it says, when Fathom Fleet Captain attacks, if you control another non-token pirate, you may pay 2. If you do, create a 2/2 black pirate creature token with menace. A 2-mana 2/1 with menace is already fine. It's a decent 2-drop. You'll play it in most decks, and that means this is a C in a deck that doesn't really have enough pirates. This comes with some extra value, though, that is really good if you did build a pirate deck. If you have another non-token pirate in play, you can pay 2 to make a 2/2 pirate with menace every time the captain attacks. Worth noting that as the game goes on, the captain will be a less effective attacker, and thus it will be harder for you to churn out pirates. But honestly, if I can attack with this, get a trade and make a pirate token, that's a pretty good deal. I think this is a B in a deck that has enough pirates in it. Next, we have Fathom Fleet Cutthroat, which for 3 generic and 1 black is a common human pirate and a 3/3, and it says, when Fathom Fleet Cutthroat enters the battlefield, destroy target creature an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. These effects always look better than they actually are. I love cards that can kill things when they come into play, but setting up this kind of effect so you actually get to kill something worth killing just isn't always going to happen. Still, it is a 4-mana 3/3 and a pirate, and it will sometimes at least be a 2-for-1. Even if you're just like killing a 1/3 that blocked your 2/2, that's some decent value. I'm going to give this a C+. It's not quite Nectar. I could definitely see it going down because these effects always end up underwhelming me. But who knows, maybe it'll even go up a little bit in this format that has a lot of vampire tokens or something. Next, we have Grim Captain's Call, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says return a pirate card from your graveyard to your hand, then do the same for vampire, dinosaur, and merfolk. The design in this card is really cool. While most decks in this format will focus on one tribe, this is a payoff for running cards from all 4, which is possible with all the treasure running around. It is not going to be very good if you only have one of the tribes in your deck. In fact, it is probably an unplayable, an F. Once you get into 2 of the tribes, it becomes playable, and if you ever return 3 or more things with this, you're just going to win. Your deck is going to have some weird composition to make that work. Lots of treasure, lots of random creatures from all the other types. You're just like a 4 or 5 color good stuff deck, which again is possible in a set filled with treasure. But I just don't think that's going to come together as often as we'd like. It does work pretty well with like Explore, because Explore can actually mill things, as we mentioned, so you can choose to throw things in your graveyard that you can just get back with Grim Captain's Call. On the whole, though, I'm going to give this a C, that can regularly get back 2 things and leave it there. But rest assured, if you can get 3 or more, I think it does move into the B range. And, you know, I would love to draft like a 4 or 5 color deck that can really abuse Grim Captain's Call, so hopefully I can record one doing that. Next, we have Heartless Pillage, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says target opponent discards 2 cards. It also has Raid, saying if you attacked with a creature this turn, create a colorless treasure artifact token. Strictly better Mind Rot isn't a bad thing. Mind Rot is usually a D-level mainboard card and a C-level sideboard card, but this does come with the added bonus of giving you treasure if you can trigger Raid. While that is upside over the original, I'm not sure it's enough to make this much better than Mind Rot usually is. Although keep in mind, lots of decks in this format will be running expensive cards because of treasure, so you will more frequently be able to hit 2 cards in your opponent's hand because they'll hold on to cards for longer than normal, and that solves a problem that discard effects often have, that they are useless in the late game. Still, I'm going to give this a D as a mainboard card and a C as a sideboard card. It's good to side in against opponents with really high curves, or people who are holding on to removal. Next, we have Kite Sail Freebooter, which is 1 generic and 1 black for a 1/2 human pirate at uncommon. It has flying, and it says, when Kite Sail Freebooter enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals his or her hand. You choose a non-creature, non-land card from it. Exile that card until Kite Sail Freebooter leaves the battlefield. A 2-mana 1/2 with flying and being a pirate is already okay, but it also helps you disrupt your opponent's game plan early by taking away your opponent's best non-creature spell. Yes, they get that card back once they kill the freebooter, but you're probably going to take away a removal spell, and that's some serious disruption. As an early game flyer, it also works well with Raid. Downside here is that sometimes you will just completely whiff with it, but you still gain some information about your opponent's deck in hand. I'm going to give this a C+ for now. Next we have Lurking Chupacabra, which is 3 generic and 1 black for a 2/3 beast horror at uncommon, and it says, whenever a creature you control explores, target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-2 until end of turn. Obviously this is a build around. The Chupacabra is terrible in decks that don't have Explorer. You don't want to be playing a 4 mana 2/3, and that means it's an F. However, get 7 or more cards with Explorer and the Chupacabra becomes very scary. It can just start picking off creatures or at least weakening them to make you able to attack, and I'm on board with that. I think this is a powerful enough build around that I'd be willing to speculate on it with the first pick in some packs. So basically, it's an F, as I said, in a deck with not enough Explorer, but I think it becomes a B the more Explorer you have. If you get to 10 cards with Explorer, this is awesome. And there are some other Explorer build arounds in other colors, and I'm really looking forward to all of the Explorer payoffs because I already love Explorer as an activated as a mechanic. Next, we have March of the Drowned, which is 1 black mana for a common sorcery, and it says, choose 1, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. It also says, return 2 target pirate cards from your graveyard to your hand. Those are your 2 options. This is a very good pirate payoff at common, and I think it is playable in a deck with 0. Since 1 mana to guarantee you draw a creature is not a bad deal, though certainly not great either. It does get better with bombs, of course. I think this is a D+ with 0 pirates. And pushes all the way into B- range if you have a lot of them. 1 mana for 2 cards is that good. That 2 for 1 goes a long way towards helping you win a game. Any deck with pirates in it will want 1 copy of this, and if you have a lot of them, you should value this card pretty highly. Next is Mark of the Vampire, which for 3 generic and a black is an aura at common. It has enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has lifelink. If you've watched me talk about limited before, you know I'm not a huge fan of auras that are used on your own creatures unless they replace themselves or give a bonus so big that it's worth the risk. Mark of the Vampire does not do either of those things. +2/+2 and lifelink is okay, but it is still too risky. Getting 2 for 1 isn't all that hard when you try to go with an aura plan. This aura doesn't give your creature evasion or anything. Basically, if your opponent kills the creature, you put this on, you're going to lose. I'm not ever going to play this card, and I'm going to give it an F. Next, we have Queen's Agent, which for 5 generic mana and 1 black is a 3/3 Vampire Scout at common. It has lifelink, and it says, when Queen's Agent enters the battlefield, it explores. Black's creatures with Explore so far all seem a little overcosted. 6 mana for a 4/4 with lifelink and some card selection, or 6 mana for a 3/3 with lifelink and you draw a card. Neither is bad, but neither is all that good either. 6 mana is a lot for a creature like this. I want a creature who really impacts the game when I get to 6, and I think I actually see myself avoiding playing this in all but the most dedicated Explorer or Vampire decks, so I'm going to give it a D. Next we have Queen's Bay Soldier, which is 1 generic and 1 black mana for a 2/2 Vampire Soldier at common. We have come a long way in Magic. 2 mana 2/2s used to be solid Cs, but power creep has made cards like this one go into the D+ range. You'll play it if you're short on 2 drops, basically. However, this does at least have the vampire creature type, which I think is enough to push this into the C- range. Next, we have Raider's Wake, which for 3 generic and 1 black mana is an uncommon enchantment, and it says whenever an opponent discards a card, that player loses 2 life. It also has Raid and says at the beginning of your end step, if you attacked with a creature this turn, target opponent discards a card. This card definitely stands a chance of having a major impact on the game and seems like an interesting build around. Making your opponent discard a card when you can raid is nice, and so is doing extra damage. However, this is going to be a magical Christmas land scenario with this card frequently. This card is going to be terrible in late game situations, and in the early game triggering raid is no guarantee. Paying 4 mana for an enchantment that doesn't affect the board at all gives you a pretty big tempo hit. I'm going to start this at D. I just don't see myself wanting to play this in most decks. I wouldn't mind being wrong, though, because it does seem like a fun way to try to win a game. Next, we have Revel Enriches, which is 4 generic and 1 black for a rare enchantment, and it says, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, create a colorless treasure artifact token. It also says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 10 or more treasures, you win the game. This card is unplayable if the only card in your deck that makes treasure is this one. You're just not going to make 10 treasure without a little help, and I think that makes this an F most of the time. But in a dedicated treasure deck, this is worth playing, and even then, just holding on to your treasures forever and not cashing them in for mana or using them with other creatures can be a pretty big problem. I would need 7 or more cards that make treasure to play this, and even then I think it's only a C. Next, we have Ruin Raider, which for 2 generic and 1 black is a 3/2 Orc Pirate at rare. It has Raid, and it says, at the beginning of your end step, if you attacked with a creature this turn, reveal the top card of your library and put that card into your hand. You lose life equal to that card's converted mana cost. You guys know me, I love drawing cards even if I have to pay life for it. A 3 mana 3/2 with one of the set's tribal creature types would already have been in the lower C range, but this has a repeatable raid effect that is insane, allowing you to draw a card Dark Confidant style during your instep. It is true that if you have several 5s and 6s in your deck, this gets a little dicey, but this will be super strong in aggro decks, and if you have one of these, you should definitely think about lowering your curve as much as possible. Raid obviously pushes you towards a more aggressive deck anyway. Eventually, the cards it draws you will allow you to just completely outcard your opponent. I'm going to actually start this at A-, and I would first pick it frequently. Next, we have Ruthless Knave. For 2 generic and 1 black, this one is a 3/2 Orc Pirate and uncommon, and it has a couple activated abilities. One of them is 2 generic and a black, sacrifice a creature, create 2 colorless treasure artifact tokens, and you can also cash in 3 treasures by sacrificing them to draw a card. Another 3 mana 3/2 with a tribal creature type, Ruthless Knave lets you cash in 3 treasures to draw a card, and I think that's pretty good. He also makes treasures himself, although you do have to lose a creature in the process. But hey, if your opponent is just killing your guy, or your creature is shut down by aura-based removal, or it has a good death trigger, or you're making lots of creature tokens, this will be pretty good. And none of those things are going to be super hard to accomplish in this format. I'm going to give him a B-. I think he's going to be first pickable in some packs. Next, we have Sanctumseeker, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 3/4 Vampire Knight at rare, and it says whenever a vampire you control attacks, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. I like this card a lot. While it is something of a build-around, it has a very high floor. A 4 mana 3/4 that drains 1 life from the opponent every time it attacks is probably a C+ on its own. Where this really gets scary is when you amass an army of vampires, at which point this becomes an absolute bomb that will end the game quickly. Like some of the other build-arounds we've seen, this one is powerful enough when you get there, and not terrible when you don't get there, making it a decent candidate for a first pick. I think it pushes into B+, maybe even A- range if you really get there on vampires. Next, we have Seeker's Squire, which for 1 generic and 1 black is a 1/2 human scouted uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you explore. This is our aggressively costed black creature with Explore we've been waiting for. I like this one a ton. 2 mana for a 2/3 and some card selection, or a 2 mana for a 1/2 that draws you a card. I'm down with either of those. This sort of reminds me of Thraben Inspector in the sense that it is an early creature that can bring some serious value in the late game as well. I'm willing to give this little 2-drop a B-. First picking it isn't out of the question. Next, we have Skittering Heartstopper, which for 1 black mana is a 1/2 insect at common and has an activated ability. You can pay 1 black, and Skittering Heartstopper gains Death Touch until end of turn. I like creatures with Death Touch, little 1-drops with Death Touch I can trade for anything, but I obviously would prefer that it was free. This does come with 1 extra toughness, which means it can block vampire tokens, which is not true of a lot of 1/1 Death Touchers who become kind of useless when your opponent's swinging at you with a bunch of 1/1s. And paying 1 black for this isn't horrendous, but it isn't great either. I think this is just a C. You're fine playing it in most black decks since it can trade with anything, though deep down I think usually you're going to wish it was just Plague Rats. Next we have Skullduggery, which is for 1 black mana, a common instant that says until end of turn, target creature you control gets +1/+1, and target creature in opponent controls gets -1/-1. This is actually a very potent combat trick. It reminds me of Subtle Strike, though it doesn't leave permanent counters on the creatures. It does cost half as much. It really isn't that hard to manufacture 2-for-1s with a card like this. Your opponent blocks your 2/2 with their 2/2, and you use Skullduggery to pump your guy and kill an X1 on their side of the battlefield. That's a great deal for 1 mana, and that's not really like a crazy situation. That's going to happen pretty often. Remember that your opponent could have Skullduggery anytime they have 1 black mana up, because it can blow you out. This is a solid card for any aggressive black deck, and most will want 1 copy of it, and that makes it a C+ for me. Next, we have Skymarch Bloodletter, which is 2 generic and 1 black for a 2/2 Vampire Soldier at common, has flying, and it says when Skymarch Bloodletter enters the battlefield, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Wizards is really making Windrake look bad lately. Last set we saw Aerial Guide, and now we have Skymarch Bloodletter. 3 mana for a 2/2 with flying is usually a solid C. Adding a useful creature type in Vampire and a decent triggered ability when it enters the battlefield makes this even better. I think this is just a C+. Next, we have Spreading Rot, which for 4 generic and 1 black is a common sorcery that says, destroy target land. Its controller loses 2 life. This card's terrible. Yes, this format has some scary lands, but they are all at rare, and they have to transform from being non-land permanents. This isn't worth mainboarding in the least, making it an F. and it is like a D, I guess, out of the sideboard. Only worth it if you run into an opponent who has one of those aforementioned scary lands, but even then it isn't going to be so exciting. Paying 5 for this effect is just way too much. Next, we have Sword Point Diplomacy, which for 2 generic and 1 black is a rare sorcery, and it says, reveal the top 3 cards of your library. For each of those cards, put that card into your hand unless any opponent pays 3 life, then exile the rest. Cards like this always bother me. Giving your opponent choices is usually not a good thing. This isn't completely unplayable, I want to say that up front, but what's going to happen a lot is when you cast this, your opponent pays 3 to keep you from drawing 1 real card, and they let you draw 2 lands. And that's not the worst thing, honestly. 3 mana to do 3 and draw 2 lands is solid, and I think that's going to be frequently what this does, but there are going to be times when your opponent has no problem just paying the full 9 because they're so far ahead, and if they're that far ahead of you, them going to 11 or whatever isn't really going to make a difference. You'd rather just draw the cards, obviously. That said, if your deck is very aggressive, this can be quite good, so if you quickly drop your opponent to, say, 10, the choices they're going to have to make are pretty ugly. This is really only playable in the most aggressive decks, but I do think it's a C. It's a solid playable. Next, we have Vanquish the Weak, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant, and it says, destroy target creature with power 3 or less. This time around, black did not get a premium removal spell at common. That doesn't happen very often. It did get lots of removal, but most of it is just solid removal and nothing special, and Vanquish the Weak is an example of that. Instant speed and killing a 3-power creature for 3 isn't bad, but it isn't great either. There are going to be games where it just doesn't make a difference because your opponent's creatures can't die to it. This is another C+. A decent removal spell for black. Any black deck probably wants one, but casting it isn't going to feel great. Next, we have Vicious Conquistador, which for 1 black mana is a 1/2 vampire soldier, and it says, whenever Vicious Conquistador attacks, each opponent loses 1 life. This card is an interesting one. When it was spoiled, I tweeted about it, and by the way, if you want to see my earliest possible thoughts on cards in new limited formats, you can follow me on Twitter at @Ixalan_magic. But anyway, I was noting how I thought people would drastically overrate this card because of its rarity, and because people think of 1 mana 1/2s as doing a good job on the vanilla test. Many people disagreed with me, saying it was a fine card, but they didn't convince me, and I think they're all overrating the thing and kind of proving my point. The trap some players fall into is thinking that a 1 mana 1/2 is good, because we should expect only a 1 mana 1/1, right? Kind of. I mean, obviously this is better than being 1/1, but a 1/2 is outclassed so quickly in Magic, like by a 2-drop, that's a 2/2, these days that Conquistador is just bad. If you go first, you might get in for 2 with it, but chances are good your opponent just plays a 2-drop that the Conquistador can't attack to into for a trade because he quickly becomes outclassed. He just can't attack after turn 2 frequently. Yeah, if your opponent like doesn't play anything on turn 2 or 3 or 4, obviously he'll be good, but that's just not going to happen very often, and if that is happening, it wouldn't matter what creature you have in play. You know, you could have a way better creature in play doing damage instead of this thing. He does have the vampire creature type, which is enough, I think, to save him from an F, but not by much. I'm giving him a D-. Next, we have Brassicas Contempt, which for 2 generic and 2 black is an instant at rare that says exile target creature or planeswalker, you gain 2 life. This is a premium removal spell. Of course, it's not at common, but it is quite good. 4 mana to exile something at instant speed is nice, and sometimes it'll even be a planeswalker. Extra life gain is just gravy. This will be first pickable most of the time, and I'm going to give it a B. Next, we have Walk the Plank, which for 2 black mana is an uncommon sorcery that says, destroy target non-merfolk creature. Here is a premium removal spell for black, and I actually think it's better than Vraska's removal spell. 2 mana to kill any non-merfolk is nice. At only 2 mana, it isn't hard to come out ahead tempo-wise either, as killing a 6 or 7 drop with this is backbreaking for your opponent. Now, sometimes you will run into someone that has a ton of merfolk, and in that case, siding it out might be necessary, but even against most merfolk decks, it's going to have enough targets to leave in. This is another B+. I think it's a first pickable removal spell. Next is Wanted Scoundrels, which for 1 generic and 1 black mana is a 4/3 human pirate with uncommon, and it says when Wanted Scoundrel dies, target opponent creates 2 colorless treasure artifact tokens. I like this card a decent amount. 2 for a 4/3 is nice. We've seen recent 2 mana 4/3s with downsides and they were playable. The downside here is quite large though. A 2 mana 4/3 is nice because it's just going to be the biggest thing on the battlefield, but once your opponent kills it, they're going to get 2 treasure tokens, which is going to ramp them and fix them, and that is going to make this a little harder for it to be great. Obviously, even though it's an easy play, because ramping your opponent up that high is not so good. And as soon as your opponent can just block this with like a 3/3, it's going to be pretty ugly. Like your opponent's going to get a lot of value. They're basically blocking with a creature that now says, when this dies, put 2 treasure into play. And that's just too good. I mean, I do think it's still playable. Aggressive decks aren't going to care. They'll play this. And I think it's a C+ just because it's so big for such a low mana cost. But it does have some serious downside. That's the last black card in Ixalan. Tomorrow I'll be back with all of the red cards in Ixalan. Also, by the way, my content's sponsored by 5colorcombo.com. You can head over to their website and use my discount code NEEDSAHONE5 for a 5% discount. They also have an app that you can download that is an awesome way to practice drafting. It uses my scores and grades from these videos to determine when the AI will pick cards, and thus is a fairly accurate representation of draft. It's a great way to practice it before release, so go ahead and check that out. Thanks for watching.